Today we're going to talk just a little bit about what is psychology. Welcome to AP Psych, and let's get started just talking about what it is and what do we think it is, and maybe a little bit about the history of psych. In terms of psychology, one of the first things we need to figure out is how can we explain behavior. That's where psychology gets involved, is trying to figure out what is it? What's the reason why people do the things they do? That's one of the central questions that psychologists have. And a lot of people, if you asked them what psychology is all about, they would say, oh, psychology is the study of the mind. Well, in part, that's correct. But what we have to also look at is what role does the mind play? What part of behavior does the mind influence? And for that matter, what is the mind? Some of you have probably never even thought about that. You've never envisioned or tried to imagine what the mind is really about. If we look at this picture here, we could all agree that this is a picture of the human brain. But that's the brain. Where is the mind? If you were to point to the mind, where would you point? Would you point to your head? And if so, is your mind inside your head? Or is it outside of you? Or is it in the brain? Or is the mind and the brain the same thing? If the mind is inside the brain, well then, if we cut the brain open, we should be able to point to the mind. But most people can't do that either. So, really, what role does the mind play in terms of behavior, and where is it and what is it? That's one of the central questions that psychology has always dealt with. And if we go back in the history, we can actually talk about the very beginning and how the mind was kind of evaluated back then. If we look at the historical development of psychology really started in terms of trying to emphasize the study of behavior in 1879 with Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, it looks like William Wundt, but it's pronounced Wilhelm Wundt. And Wilhelm Wundt is considered the father of psychology. He's the father. He's your daddy. Okay, if somebody says who's your daddy, that's Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, he's the daddy of psych. He's the first guy that actually opened up a psychology laboratory. He did so in Germany in 1879, and he was very interested in studying the mind. Edward Titchener and Wilhelm Wundt, the two of them, actually started what we'd call the first school of thought or the first perspective in psych, and that was called structuralism. When I talk about a perspective or a school of thought, what we're talking about here is a way of evaluating behavior. Okay? How did they try to evaluate things? And what they tried to do was they tried to study the mind. But they wanted to study, as the word says, the structure of the mind. And if you think about the structure of the mind, we would have to talk about what does the mind look like? What's it composed of? Where is it? Okay, are there various parts to the structure of the mind? And that was the question that Titchener and Wundt and several other people in the early days of psychology tried to figure out. Now, that school of thought or that perspective is called structuralism. One of their major methods of investigating this was to ask people to be introspective. They used a technique called introspection. And that is basically when you ask someone to look inside their self and to kind of analyze their own thinking, their own feeling, their own behaviors, and try to see if they can answer those things. If you've ever been introspective, well, then you may have sat around for time periods trying to figure out, now why did I do that? Why did I do the things that I did? Why did I react to my parents the way I reacted? Or why did I do this in school when I knew I shouldn't have, or I knew I should have done something else? That's being introspective, trying to analyze your own thoughts and feelings. It's not very scientific, but that was kind of the method that they used very frequently. Now, not everybody in psychology, in the world of psych, were structuralists. Not everybody believed that that was the main thing to study. So William James, he's kind of the founder of what we call functionalism. That was a different school of thought. That was a different group of people. And essentially that group, they looked more at, and again, the word kind of tells it, they tried to figure out the function of the mind. What's the purpose of the mind? What does it do for us? How does it work? They basically said, hey, we're never going to figure out what the mind is. They said basically that the mind is this kind of invisible quantity that we're not going to be able to figure out the structure of, so why bother? Instead, they focused more on questions like, how does the mind affect us? How does it work? How does it tick? How does it function? Okay, so that's the functionalist group. They were influenced by Darwin. James anyway, was influenced by Darwin. James also wrote the very first psychology textbook, first one of all time. And that, I believe it was in the 1890s when he wrote Principles of Psychology. And that book was around for many, many years. That was kind of the first guideline for the study of psych, was that textbook. William James was considered the father of American psychology. So don't get the two confused. If we said, who's the father of psych, that's Wundt. Okay? All right. Now, this was all this was going on in the late 1800s. In the 1900s, we have different groups that emerge, different people that emerge. And one of the most influential was a guy by the name of Sigmund Freud. And Freud was very influential because he came up with a revolutionary concept that nobody else had thought of before. And that was something that he called the unconscious mind. Freud believed that your mind is actually composed of different parts. Now, we'll study him in depth later in the semester, but for now, the key thing that you need to remember is that he introduced the idea of what he called the unconscious mind. He said the largest part of our mind consists of things that we are not even aware of. They're our deepest fears, our phobias, our wishes, our desires, our memories of things that we don't claim memory of. In other words, if we talked about events that happened when you were 3 years old and you said, well, I don't remember that, Freud would say, well, that's down in your unconscious mind. He would say you didn't forget it. It's not lost. It's simply down deep in the unconscious mind. And it's very difficult to get there. Now, here's the key to the unconscious mind, is that Freud believed all these things, you have so much stuff down there in your unconscious mind, and that stuff is influencing you on a day-to-day basis. Your behavior every day is being influenced by things in your unconscious mind, and you're not even aware of it. That revolutionized the thinking in psychology because nobody had ever come up with that before. Okay? Now, not everybody believed in Freud. And there's a group of people known as the behaviorists. John Watson was one of the instrumental foremost people in the field of behaviorism. Later, in the middle and late 1900s, a guy by the name of B.F. Skinner. He's going to be very important that we'll talk about. These two individuals were strict behaviorists. Basically, they believed that your behavior was influenced by rewards and punishments. If you are rewarded for something, you're going to be more likely to do it again in the future. If you're punished for something, you're going to be you're going to be less likely to do that behavior in the future. And they went so far as to say, if you even watched other people be punished or receive reinforcement, that those things can affect you. So behaviorist, it sounds very simple, but behaviorists study observable behavior. They looked at what was there. They didn't believe. If you talk to Skinner, he did not believe in Freud's idea of the unconscious mind at all. In fact, Skinner said you can't even prove that the mind exists, so therefore you should never study it. That's kind of radical, but that was the belief of Skinner. Now, another area within psychology, and it's still very existent today, but started in the 20th century, and that is Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and the humanistic field of psychology. The humanistic field of psych believes that each one of us is driven to reach our potential. We're driven to try and be the best person we can be. We set goals and we try and attain those goals. We try and grow as much as we can as a person. And it's those things, those goals, and that desire for what they call self-actualization, when we can become the best person we can be. It's that desire that guides our behavior and is very instrumental for us. Okay? Another field that has really come of age in psychology, and especially in the last 25 years, is the area of cognitive neuroscience. Now, in this class, whenever you see the word cognitive, I want you to think of the word thinking. Cognitive means thinking. So if we now analyze this, we're going to see the word cognitive, which means thinking. We see neuroscience, the science or the study of neurology. In other words, what's going on in our body, what's going on in our brain. So this is looking at how changes in the brain can affect our thinking, which therefore affects our behavior. This field has opened up dramatically in the last 25 years because of all the new scanning techniques, the idea that we can look at the living brain and watch it in action with various PET scans and MRIs and CAT scans, things like that. So this is a huge field in the area of psychology today. Now, this gets us down to kind of some central questions here, and that is, what is psych? Okay? Psych kind of evolved over the years out of a variety of things. You're going to see a lot of biology. You're going to see a lot of physiology, okay? Philosophy and science. One of the key things that you're going to notice in this class is we emphasize the scientific study of behavior. We don't just take something for granted because our mom or our dad or our grandmother said so. We study it and try and figure out why those things happen. Different levels that we analyze things. We're going to look at things biologically. We're going to look at things psychologically. In other words, how did it make a person think or feel? And we're going to look at it social-culturally. In other words, does our culture influence the way we behave in a variety of ways? And I think you'll easily admit that yes, it does. So let's talk about, what do we define psychology as? Psychology, basically, for our purposes, is going to be defined as the science and study of behavior and mental processes. We're going to look at behavior. We have to look at behavior. That's a key to psych right there. But we're also going to emphasize the mental aspect of that. So we're looking at behavior, we're looking at the mental side. Getting back to our question about what is the mind, most people today believe that the mind is what the brain does. In other words, the brain acts in various ways, and it more or less creates the mind. It's a very difficult thing to understand. But that's why psychology is so fascinating, and that's why I think you're going to love studying the things that we do in this semester.